I was born on February the 20th, 1920. That seemed like a long time ago, way back in the ancient times. But having grown up in the early 20s, it was an exciting time in my life. And then along came the 30s, and we had a depression. As kids, we didn't know we were having a depression because we didn't know there was anything any different. We were doing fine, we did fine before, and at the time we were doing fine, but there was a depression. Now we knew there was not a lot of money around. We didn't have four-wheelers and rollerblades and snowmobiles and all those things, pickup trucks like kids have today. I graduated from high school in 1939. That was in the spring of '39. I stayed home all that summer and worked on the farm. And in the wintertime, probably in January, I read or heard somewhere where Uncle Sam was paying those who entered the military service, that he was paying them $21 a day, once a month. I didn't join the service at that time, as I had just received a call from my sister, Dorothy, in Salt Lake City, who was teaching school there. She said she was acquainted with a man that was working out at Wendover in the State Line Hotel and Casino, and that they were looking for someone to work in a service station out there. And so she called and wanted to know if I'd be interested in coming out and going out, and I said, sure, I would. So come February, the last of February, I went to Wendover. And I worked in the service station there and all summer long. And come the 1st of August, two of my friends, a cousin and a friend, we were buddies during grade school and also during high school, came through there, and they said they had joined the Army Air Corps. And they were on their way to Moffett Field, and they were in the 18th Pursuit Squadron. And they said, why don't you quit your job and go into the recruiting sergeant and join the military and come out to Moffett Field to get in the 18th Pursuit Squadron, and we'll continue to have fun like we've had all through school. And so I thought, well, that sounded good. I quit my job and I went home, and I talked to my father about it, and he didn't want me to go. Finally, he consented. I went to Salt Lake to the recruiting sergeant and told him what I wanted, and he told me that the 18th Pursuit Squadron was full. But he said in a couple of weeks they're going to be transferred to Hamilton Field. That's a base north of San Francisco. And he says, why don't we send you there? And I thought to myself, well, that's just as good. If we're there together, what difference does it make what outfit we're in as long as we're together? So I went to Hamilton Field, and in a couple of weeks here they came. And we were there about 2 weeks, and we went out and had our fun. We went roller skating and bowling, and then 150 men were sent back to Fort Douglas, and I was one of the 150. So much for the fun with our buddies. They went to Alaska. They never saw any action during the war. My story is somewhat different. I beg your pardon. I have a hard time, even though this happened over 50 years ago. It's still very real in my mind, and I have a difficult time controlling my emotions. So if I get carried away, you'll have to forgive me. We were stationed at Fort Douglas, and there the headquarters squadron of the 5th Air Base Group was organized. And in October sometime of 1941, the headquarters squadron of the 5th Air Base Group received orders to prepare to leave on a secret mission, the code name Plum. It wasn't for a few months later that we learned what the mysterious code word Plum was. Before leaving Fort Douglas, however, the 4th Chemical Company and the 2nd Quartermaster Company was attached to the 5th Air Base. Sometime around the middle of October, we left Fort Douglas. We boarded a train at Salt Lake City, and we en route to San Francisco and Fort McDowell. On the 27th of October of 1941, we were put on the USS UL Scott, and we started sailing west. And we sailed west for 10 days, and at that time we came to the Hawaiian Islands. And I remember thinking to myself, wow, this is Plum. This is going to be a great place to be stationed. And about that time a message came over the speaking system, said, now hear this, we will be here for 3 days, after which time you will report back aboard ship. In 3 days we were on the ship again, sailing west. Another 15 days, which would have been 14 days, would have been the 19th of November, a message came in over the radio. It said, now hear this. On the port side of the ship is the island of Leyte. We looked to the port side of the ship, and down there about 100 miles or so looked like a dot of something, and could be an island. And then he said, on the starboard side of the ship is the island of Samar. And of course we all looked to the starboard side of the ship, and way down there another 100 miles on the horizon looked like another dot there that could be an island. And then in a magical romantic voice he said, welcome to the Philippine Islands. We sailed all that day and that night, and the next morning we were at the mouth of Manila Bay. Later, steaming past the island fortress of Corregidor, at the entrance of Manila Bay, we could easily see why Corregidor was affectionately known as the Rock. It was a solid rock out in the Manila Bay, probably 1.5 miles wide and 3.5 miles long. And they had tunneled in this rock for many years, and they had roads in there, they had a hospital in there. It was just like a small city in that fortress there at the entrance to Manila Bay. Little did we know then, or would we be able to comprehend the fate that would befall that rock in just about 7 months. No, less than that. As we sailed past Corregidor, it was amazing to see sticking out of the water masts of what remained of the Spanish fleet that had been annihilated by Commodore Dewey some 40 years earlier in the Spanish-American War. The island and islets composing the archipelago number 7,105, but only 2,773 of these have been named. We were taken into the harbor at Manila. We were taken off the ship. We were loaded on trucks and taken south of Manila, some 20, 30 miles to a military base called Fort McKinley. Now, that was November the 20th, 1941, and on that month and that day and year was Thanksgiving Day, November the 20th. I'll never forget that. Our cooks thought they would fix us a Thanksgiving dinner, and they did, but you could never imagine what they fixed for Thanksgiving dinner. Sauerkraut and wieners. Little did we realize, though, how we would welcome such a meal in just about 5 months. We were there for about a week, and then we were put on an inter-island boat, the MS Legazpi, and we were taken south down through a lot of the islands, some 300 miles to the island of Mindanao. And then the code word plum came. P stood for the Philippines, where we were headed for. LU stood for the Luzon, where we would land, and then M for Mindanao, where we would be stationed. When we got there, we were taken off the boat, we were put on trucks, and we traveled inland some 15 or 20 miles uphill to a plateau where Del Monte had 19,000 acres of pineapple. It was quite a sight. We were instructed to clean off an area, make a clearing suitable for an air base. We also cleaned off an area to set up our tents. Now this was December the 1st of 1941. We were told that additional equipment, including guns and ammunition, would be on the next incoming ship. But just 1 week later, on December the 7th, we received the news of the Japanese bombing Pearl Harbor and President Roosevelt's declaration of war. We knew then there would be no ships coming in. We were on our own, completely unequipped to fight a war. Our thoughts ranged far and wide. We had many questions. Had the Japanese proceeded farther east with their attack on Pearl Harbor? And if not, why not? Would the west coast of the United States be able to defend itself? What about Panama Canal? Would there be sabotage there? And why Hawaii? Why not the Philippines? These thoughts and questions went through our mind. We knew we were at war, but to us it was thousands of miles away. Shortly after noon, on December the 7th, we were called together for an announcement that Clark Field had been bombed by the Japanese. That was the island of Luzon. Now we knew that the war had arrived. That was only a few hundred miles away. The war had definitely come to the Philippines. But having kept the Japanese bogged down in the Philippines for 5 months, we knew we could not hold out much longer. General MacArthur, who had been the commanding general in the Philippines, of all the Philippine forces, on March the 19th, had been ordered back to Australia to put another army together and come back through the islands and retake the islands that the Japanese had captured. But when he left the Philippines, he left General Wainwright in charge of the armed forces in the Philippines. On May the 9th of 1942, at the commanding general post on the island where we were, received a radio message from General Wainwright on Craigidor, which had fallen a couple of days before, trying to explain to General Sharp who was the general of all the Philippine forces on the island of Mindanao, that the Japanese were holding them hostage in Malinta Tunnel, threatening to shoot all of them unless he, General Wainwright, ordered and persuaded General Sharp to surrender. His last words were, "In the interest of humanity and for God's sake, surrender." The immediate consensus was that this was it. After all, Wainwright's plea was desperate. What was to be gained by giving cause for more blood to be shed at Corregidor? And what was to be gained by continuing fighting in our sector against impossible odds? The next day was May the 10th. That was Mother's Day that year, and we were ordered to surrender then. There were some of us thought we would not surrender. We would take off to the jungles. We would rather fight the Japanese in a guerrilla band than surrender. Then we got to thinking the possibility of the Filipinos turning us into the Japanese for a few pesos. So we changed our minds. We decided that we would surrender. We were so sure that the Americans, General MacArthur, would be coming back through the islands in 2 months, 3 months, 4 months at the most. Little did we realize what lay ahead of us. Had we known, we would not have surrendered. When we went into prison camp, I prayed to my Father in heaven to protect me, to give me the strength and the courage to face whatever lie ahead. The thought of never seeing my family again. Tears rolled down my cheeks, tears for them at my loss, and tears for my own fear of dying. I relived my whole life in just a short time, going over my mistakes, my sins of omission and commission. I wondered if the Lord thought I was worthy of saving. When Wake Island and Guam fell in December of 1942, the first of 25,600 American servicemen were captured in the Pacific Theater. By the end of the war, 34% were dead. Poor nutrition from lack of food combined with tropical elements, extreme heat and humidity, mosquitoes and mites, created a breeding ground which ran rampant throughout the prison camps. Without medicine, open sores soon festered. Injuries went untreated. Yet prisoners struggled to continue working, not knowing their fate if they hadn't. Despite such deplorable conditions, none of the prisoners tried to escape. Of all white prisoners, 1 in 3 died in captivity at the hands of the Japanese, starved to death, worked to death, beaten to death, or died of loathsome epidemic diseases that the enemy would not treat. You know, the fall of the Philippines and the capture of the garrison there was one of the single greatest military disasters ever to befall this nation. Yet it wrote one of the brightest pages in history of valor and courage as the forlorn American and Philippine forces, fighting without any hope, help, aid, or relief, upset the Japanese invasion schedule. Our first prison camp was at WWII. There was 1,000 Americans and 11,000 Filipinos. After being there for 6 months, We were put on a ship. We went to the northern part. We were taken to the northern part of the island of Mindanao and put on a ship, and we traveled north and up around the north end of the Mindanao, down the east coast to the southern and the east side of Mindanao to a town called Davao. Davao was a fairly large city. We were taken off the boat. We had to march 40 or 50 miles. We marched without carrying what things we had, and to a place called Davao Penal Colony. Now, Davao Penal Colony occupied thousands of acres, set in a very dense, almost impenetrable jungle in the most malaria-infested area in the Philippines. This camp had been used as a maximum security prison for hardened Filipino criminals during peacetime. It was like our former Alcatraz in that its very setting was a deterrent to anyone thinking of escape. The colony itself had been designed to be self-sustaining. There was a large coffee, avocado, banana, sugarcane, abaca plantation consisting of 440 acres each. There was a large area for growing vegetables, 1,100 acres. There was also a chicken farm, a pasture for the Brahma steers used to cultivate the vegetable plantation. Also a pasture area for the carabaos that were used to plow and harrow the rice fields. A narrow gauge railroad ran through the colony from the east to the west. If we could have just had a small amount of some of the food we helped to grow, it would have saved a lot of lives. After being there for a couple of weeks, there were 200 of us put on trucks and taken into Davao. There we worked at a sawmill, and some worked on the ship. They would take they were taking lumber out of the Philippines to Japan. They would get this lumber out of the sawmill, and they would bring it to the dock, and they would take big loads of it and drop down in the hold of the ship. And they had prisoners down there in the hold of these ships trying to straighten that lumber out before the next load came in. And it didn't always get done. I imagine that lumber, when it got to Japan, wasn't worth very much. But the Japanese did things in a funny way. Then after we got that work done, we were taken to, just back of Davao, there was a big mountain that was called Mount Apo. Just immediately back of Davao, it rose to a height of 9,690 feet, the highest mountain in the Philippines. We were taken there for road details and for the harvest of rami. Now, rami reminded me of a raspberry patch. We went in there with sickles, and we had to cut this rami. And if we get a big armload, then we'd take one of these stems that we had cut, and you could wrap it around this rami bundles, and then some would come along with their cart. The Japanese or the Filipinos would come along with their caribous and the carts and load these in there and take them down to the harvesting area. They'd take and run these through some machinery and flatten them out, and they would just come out just like, it looked like strands of silk is what it did after they'd hang them on a line to dry. We don't know what they'd done with it, but it was quite a pretty sight. It was not difficult to stand on the slopes of the Mount Apo, gazing east and dream of the land that lay half a world and a whole hemisphere away. America, home, loved ones, and freedom. Many a daydream come from looking down out in the ocean and seeing what lay beyond. On June the 23rd, we left the plantation. We're taken back, after we'd been there 3 months, we're taken back to the WWII penal colony. At the WWII penal colony, there was many different kinds of details. There was road details, there was ditch details, and the rice and the vegetables. There was just all kinds of work to be done. When they had taken, there had been prisoners there before, Filipino prisoners there before that run the farm. And when we got there, they had taken all these prisoners to another island. But they left some of them there to show us what needed to be done on this plantation. There were two buddies of mine, Woodrow Dunkley from Franklin, Idaho, and Marion Cotty from Stuttgart, Arkansas. And we were good buddies. One day Woodrow and I was put on a detail with 4 other prisoners. We were to go over to the Japanese headquarters, and right in front of the Japanese headquarters was 4 great big baskets of bananas. They must have been about 4 or 5 feet across the top and about 2 feet deep. And then they had woven bamboo handles on these baskets where you'd have to stick a pole through them, and 3 men get on each end of the pole to lift those baskets. Now we were getting kind of hungry, and every time we could steal something to eat, we did. We saw all these bananas there. Now, can you imagine stealing a banana and having to peel it and stuffing it in your mouth and then getting it swallowed, chewed and swallowed before you got caught? Or you'd have banana coming out the corners of your mouth, and it would all be almost impossible to do. But on top of one of these baskets of bananas was a big purple, juicy looking grape. Cluster of them. And I said to my friend Woodrow, I says, why don't we just back up to that with our hands behind us, and while the guards aren't looking, we just reach down and pluck a couple of those grapes, put them in our mouths, and they won't even know we've got them. So we did. We plucked a couple of grapes off there, and we put them in our mouth, and we chewed a couple of times, and we swallowed, and tears came to our eyes. I looked at him, and he looked at me. We thought we were going to die. We wondered what in the world we'd got hold of. It kind of took our breath away. We couldn't talk. Our throat would stick together. It'd stick, and then when you'd swallow, and then it'd break loose. Finally, when we got to it, kind of wore off. There was a Japanese lieutenant there was with his guards, and he could speak English. And we asked him what those grape-looking things were, and he said they were blueberries. He said the Filipinos take tobacco leaves and roll them up to make cigars. They would use this blueberry to glue them together. And that's what it was. It was as though we'd swallowed a spoonful of Lupageous glue. We never ate no more purple grapes in the Philippines after that. If you happen to be in the rice field in a certain rice paddy, and there happened to be a python in that rice paddy, and you helped catch it, you could get a chunk of python meat. And you could take this in at the end of the day's work, and you could get a charcoal burner and cook it and have it on your rice, and it helped to fill up the empty space in your stomach. And if a dog or a cat happened to get inside the compound, they never left. I don't know whatever happened to them. You'd be surprised what you'll eat when you're starving. At different times while we were there at the penal colony, there were different groups taken out at different times, like we were. The 200 of us went to this Mount Apple. And then there was other times that they took different ones out. And after we'd been in prison camp for 2 years and 3 months, it was on March the 1st of 1944, 600 prisoners were taken out of the colony there to go to Lasang to build an airfield. There were a lot of men in that group. Let's see, there was I think about 75 from the 5th Air Base that was in that group that went. Now there were 3 Christensens in the 5th Air Base group, and I was on the top of the list, and then there was 2 others right below me, and these other 2 Christensens were taken on this Lasang detail. We never heard from them again during the war. I'll talk about it in just a minute. 3 months later, on June the 6th, the rest of us was taken out of the colony. There was 1,400 of us. Now, I forgot to mention, when we come back from Mount Apple, there had been another 1,000 prisoners brought down from Luzon. Some of these prisoners had been on Bataan Death March. And so there was 2,000 Americans there, so that left 1,400 of us after they'd taken the 600 out. Well, we were put on trucks, and then we were going to be taken to Davao. Now, there was 30 men to a truck. There was about 46 trucks. They certainly didn't take any chances for us to escape. We were ordered to get up in the trucks. We were forced to take off our shoes and our socks. They blindfolded us. They tied us together and then tied us to the side of the truck. And then we were told to sit down or kneel and to be absolutely quiet while we were traveling through the jungle. Now, some of the blindfolds were not put on too tight, so some of the prisoners could see by looking down and out the corner, they could see what was happening alongside of the road. Then there were Japanese guards, military men. There was trucks periodically with soldiers in them, and we thought that possibly they were expecting an ambush. But maybe lucky for us and lucky for them, an ambush didn't happen. We finally got out of the jungle. They let us they took the blindfolds off and they let us stand up. We got to Davao, and we were put on one of their ships. We called these ships hell ships. The prisoners named them so because of the conditions that existed on them. There was no latrine facilities on these ships. All they had was a 5-gallon bucket in the middle of one of these holes. And when they got full, they wasn't in no hurry to empty them. And there was a lot of prisoners had diarrhea, and it was a real mess. It was sickening. Our convoy consisted of 4 merchant ships and 2 sub-chasers, and they stayed close together and close to the land while we traveled at night, or during the day, and at night we would pull in close to the shore. We arrived at Zamboanga on June the 14th, toward evening. Now there were over 1,000 prisoners that was crammed down the hold of this ship, and to make room for that many prisoners, there was 1,400 on there. They had built tiers out of lumber, but these tiers had been built so close together that you could not sit up straight, nor could you nor could you, when you lie down, could you stretch out full length. So they allowed 400 of us to stay on top, and I was lucky to be one in the 400 that got to stay on top. About midnight, a lot of shooting started place, and everyone was awakened, and we learned that Colonel McGee had jumped overboard. What he had done, he had his officer friend throw his barracks bag over one side of the ship, and when it hit the water and made a splash, the Japanese guards right there started firing in, and of course when the other Japanese soldiers on the ship heard all this, they was all over to that side shooting in the water because they could see something down there. And while all this was going on, Colonel McGee went unnoticed off the other side of the ship. He reached the shore okay, and he got through the Japanese garrison, and he became a leader in the guerrilla organization 3 months later, when the survivors of the ill-fated Lasang detail reached land after their hell ship had been torpedoed and sunk off the coast of Zamboanga. We started sailing the next day, and we were on our way to Cebu, the island of Cebu. It took us about 5 days from where we were to get there because the ship was having problems. It could hardly go. Finally, when we reached Cebu, they unloaded us, and we were there for about 3 days in a stockade, you might say. And they had us unload the ship and load it on another ship. And finally, we were on our way again to Manila. And it was on June the 24th, our ship docked at Manila. The Japanese lined us up on the docks in columns of fours, and then they marched us through the streets of Manila. And what a ragged, dirty-looking bunch of men we were. So completely opposite to the young, clean men in pressed uniforms and spit-shine shoes that they had seen 2.5 years ago. We could only wonder what they thought of us now. And then finally the answer came. They could not speak to us. They were not allowed to speak to us. But all of a sudden, from an upstairs window, came the words from a familiar song in the 1940s. Some brave soul was playing the record, "There's a great day tomorrow." And what a day brightener that was. As the Japanese guards would pass by the civilians that was lying on the road, the civilians would give us the V sign for victory. We finally reached Bilibid prisons where we were taken, and there we were put into 2 groups. They went down through the ranks looking at us, and they would say, "You go over here, you go over here." There were 2 groups. Tell you where to go. After they got all through, we learned that this one group was going to go to Japan to work in the factories. This other group was sick. They couldn't work, so they were going to stay in the Philippines. Now, I don't know how they could tell who was sick and who was not, because we were all sick and starving. But I was in the group that was going to go to Japan to work in the factory. We left Manila on the 4th of July of 1944. About 60 years ago. But we had boiler trouble with the ship during the night, and the convoy pulled away from us. And the next morning we found out that we were back in the Manila harbor again. And we stayed there for 2 weeks. On that ship. They didn't get us off. We stayed right there. The food and the water situation became acute. The weather was hotter than the name we had given the ships, making conditions almost beyond human endurance. On July the 16th, about 10 o'clock, we were able to get into the pier and have our boilers repaired. In 2 hours they were repaired, and we were on our way again with another convoy. We continued to have trouble with that ship all the way to Japan. We got so far away from Manila, the Luzon, that we couldn't return. There were islands all the way from there up to Japan, and every time they had trouble, they would pull into one of these islands, and it was a kind of a blessing, you might say, in that every time they pulled into one of these islands, they let the anchor down to hold the ship while they repaired it. And when we got ready to go again, of course, they had to pull the anchor. And when they did this, they had to start all this machinery on the docks, or on the deck of the ship that they had, that they would use to load these holds with cargo. And then periodically they let us come up on the deck. And of course, when this happened, we could get to where some of these lines were in this machinery that was all over the deck. We could get to a little valve, and we could get our canteen full of water, because they was only giving us a cup of water a day, and it was hotter than blazes, and it wasn't enough water for us. And so there was a chance for us to get a little extra water there. I don't know if it was good for us or not, and I don't know if anybody died from drinking it, but I didn't. And it was a little extra water for us. They gave us a canteen or a mess kit full of rice, one mess kit full of rice a day, and this one canteen cup of water on our way to Japan. We arrived at Moji, that's on the island of Kyushu, on September the 2nd of 1945, or 44. Except for a few days in Cebu and Manila, our home had been in the bowels of 3 different hell ships since June the 6th. The entire summer, we had not even had a chance to take a bath in all that time, barely having enough water to drink, let alone take a bath. Our bodies and our clothes was positively filthy. Men had died, buried at sea. Some had gone crazy. Some had almost given up. They'd be the next to die. And I prayed that this would never happen to me. That I wouldn't get to the point where I would lose faith, where I would lose hope. There had been a number of hell ships where there had been greater loss of life and greater suffering, but none had exceeded our length and time in hell. It took 90 days for us to get from the Philippines to Japan, where it should have only taken a week or a few days. It was around June the 12th of 1944 when prisoners were often herded into transports that unknowingly became targets for Allied planes and submarines. Crammed below deck, we were trapped with no way out. When a ship was hit and those that managed to get free in the water, most of them were either shot or their heads cut off with a saber or stabbed in the back with a bayonet as the Japanese went around in their lifeboats searching for survivors. The 600 men that had gone out on this Lasang detail was on one such ship. The Shinyo Maru was sunk by the USS Paddle off the coast of Zamboanga Province, Mindanao, on September the 7th. That was 5 days after we had landed in Japan on our ship. There was a loss of 688 prisoners. 83 reached the shore after being in water all night. 3 of those was members of the 5th Air Base. And there was another person on there by the name of Lyle Knutson. He was from Portage, Utah, just a town north, 20 miles from where we live. We had gone to school with him, high school with him. He was one of the survivors that made it too. The Asarian Maru was torpedoed October the 24th, 1944 in the South China Sea. 1,790 prisoners lost. 8 survived. It was sunk by the USS Snook. The Oroka Maru was torpedo bombed by U.S. forces December the 15th, 1944, off the Bataan coast near Subic Bay. Survivors were put in the Nora Maru and the Brazil Maru. After a 45-day journey, they reached Japan with about 375 survivors, 1,243. Having died as a result of bombings, exposure, disease, and starvation. Our ship, this is the Sakita Maru, was the last ship to reach Japan, not having been bombed or torpedoed. I remember as we sailed along, we could hear them dropping depth charges off the back end of our ship. And we thought at the time, most of us, that we wouldn't care if the submarines would come. And blow our ship out of the water. We had been there so long, and it seemed like we was never going to get out. So we didn't care. According to Japanese figures, 25 ships carrying prisoners of war were bombed or torpedoed on their way to Japan. Of the 50,000 they shipped, 10,000 died at sea. As the Allied forces continued to drive the Japanese toward their home islands, Tokyo sent out orders concerning the 100,000 Allied prisoners, which said, "You will all die," by order of the Emperor. Orders given stated whether they are destroyed individually or in groups, mass bombings, poisonous smoke, drowning, decapitation, or what, dispose of the prisoners as the situation dictates. In any case, it is the aim not to allow the escape of a single prisoner, to annihilate them all and not leave any traces. Even the Emperor's demand to surrender after the second atomic blast over Nagasaki could not save hundreds of Allied prisoners who were executed by their humiliating captors in final acts of brutality in August of 1945. Over 132,000 documented Allied prisoners, Dutch, Australian, English, and American, more than 35,000 died while in captivity. In German camps, the POW rate was only 4%. In Japanese prison camps, of all Allied prisoners, the death rate was 27%. But in just the American prison camps alone, the death rate was higher. So we couldn't see out. We traveled about 24 hours. And then we finally reached the town of Yokkaichi, and we were taken to a copper smelter factory. There would be 500 prisoners working there. There must have been half that many, about 250 already there, of Japanese, Dutch, English, and Australian prisoners. They had passed us on the way going to Japan because of the trouble we were having with our ship. At this factory at Yokkaichi, we was right out on a peninsula. We had water on 4 sides of us. And as we entered the factory area from our barracks, there was a shrine right at about 50 yards from where we went into the factory area. There was also a chimney. It was probably the tallest chimney in Japan, or the second to the tallest. It was 300 meters tall, between 990 feet and 1,000 feet. It was an amazing structure with a base in excess of 50 feet in diameter. Some coal, but mostly coke, was used to fire the blast furnaces. This chimney was to help carry the fumes from the sulfuric acid and the smelting process into the atmosphere. And every time we went into the factory, we had to face this shrine. We had to do this all by Japanese. We would goose step up to this for about 20 yards before we got to it, and then 20 yards after we left it, we'd get up to this place and we would stop. As we was going along, it would be Ichi-ni San-si, Ichi-ni San-si, and then Dentai Tamari is stop. And then Migi Muki Migi was left face. And then we'd Datsubo, take off our hats and bow. And then we'd Chakubo, put our hats back on, Hadori Muki Hadori, right face. And then Mai Same, the way we go. At this time when we stopped and bowed there to the shrine, we got to thinking this was a time to pray. And so we did. And you could hear all kinds of prayers. They'd pray for a letter from home, or Red Cross packages, or a full bowl of rice for this next meal. There were about 10 or 15 different groups that worked at that factory. They had 3 shifts running that factory. I was in a group called Shokets. And I don't know what that means, but we were shoveling, it looked like dirt, but it was heavier than dirt. It was a mineral of some kind, and you get a shovel full on you, or get a load of that on your shovel, you couldn't lift it. You'd only get a half a shovel full, and then you'd throw it into a small gauge railroad car, and when it got full, we'd push it down the railroad track to a hopper and push it in. When we get to the hopper, then we'd have to dump it in there. And it would go on a conveyor belt off through the factory somewhere, and then another group was over here doing something else and loading something else on this conveyor belt, and it would go off into these blast furnaces, and when it come out, there'd be either copper ore plates or brass ore plates that they were manufacturing, and then they would be sent to another factory to make whatever out of them they was going to. It was cold in Japan. In the winter, it's the same latitude as we are on here. We slept in the clothes that we worked in. We had one blanket, and it was kind of made out of rice straw, and it's a blanket that wouldn't fold down around you. It was kind of like a piece of cardboard. And so our nights in Japan was terrible. At work, during the day, before it got cold and was starting to freeze, when we was on the detail, we were close to the beach, and when the Japanese guards would leave us, we had what they called stick guards. We didn't have military guards with us. There were some on the factory area, but mostly these were stick guards. They were civilians, and they would leave once in a while and go and talk to their buddies in the boiler room. And when they did, we would take turns running off down to the beach and gather up orange peelings and lettuce leaves and cabbage leaves, and we would take them into the barracks when we'd go to the next meal, and we could wash them and cut them up in our rice, and it would help to fill us up a little bit. We had an earthquake while we were there. The railroad tracks that was in the factory area looked like spaghetti. And when the earthquake got through, the water lines were broken, the acid lines were broken, acids spewing all over, and the same with water. It was a real mess. Shortly after that, we had a typhoon in our barracks. In our barracks, there must have been about 12 different rooms. We had 6 on each side of a hallway, and in each of these rooms, there was room enough for 40 prisoners. There was 10 on top and 10 on the bottom on one side, and then same on the other side. And we were on the top deck on this when this typhoon came, and the water kept rising, and we was on the top deck. We could go no farther. when all of a sudden it stopped and the water receded and went back into the ocean. I remember else we could go to the boiler room on the factory area there, and we could get our canteens full of hot water. We drank hot water all the time we were in Japan. And I remember going there once, and there was an old gentleman there who was the boiler tender, and he was eating his lunch. And he gave me half of his baked potato that he had. I shall never forget that, even though we were at war with these people. There were some of them who had feelings for us, I'm sure. I got to the point where I felt that I couldn't go any farther. I had wore myself out. That winter in Japan, I had worked hard not to help the Japanese, but to keep warm. And come spring, I was just worn right completely out. And periodically, they'd have us get on this slag pile where this hot ore would come out of the blast furnace and down into the little dishes, and it'd slop out over the edge, and periodically they had us on there to break this up so that it would keep it from building up. And we was on that this one day, and we had about a 12-pound sledgehammer, and you could hardly lift it. And I thought to myself, this is it. I can't take this anymore. I dropped the sledgehammer and I went to the guard and I told him I wasn't working anymore. They took me to the guardhouse there and they beat me up. But I didn't feel a thing. Finally, they decided to take me back to the barracks. I didn't know if they were going to shoot me there or... They took me back to the barracks. I lay there on my bunk thinking about what was going on. And I got to thinking about home. And then I thought of a couple of things that I had saved all this time. I got them out. One of them was a picture of my father and mother. The other was my patriarchal blessing. And I read my patriarchal blessing. And I reread it, and I reread it. And I prayed that I might be able to overcome the feeling that I had, that I might be able to regain my strength, my health back again. And I started to get better. And I got well enough that I was able to go back to work again at the factory. My patriarchal blessing was given to me by my grandfather when I was 8 years old. He was the patriarch of the stake at that time. They don't give patriarchal blessings at that young age anymore. Around June the 1st, 1945, 150 of us in 3 different groups was taken from the factory at Yokkaichi and sent to other places. We went to a factory, the group that I was in went to a factory almost straight across the continent from where we were at Yokkaichi to a place called Toyama. It was another smelter factory. We had air raids periodically. On August the 2nd of 1945, we were ordered out of our beds and told to get in our shelters that had been built. The shelters were about 20 feet by 20 feet square and 6 feet deep. And of course we complied, and we sat there on the bare dirt, leaning against the bare walls of this hole. And after an hour or so, we tried to persuade the guards to let us go back to bed, but they declined our pleadings. Then about midnight, we heard the wailing of sirens far off. Next, sharp blasts pierced the air. And we knew from past experiences that the airplanes were coming into our area. Searchlight began to crisscross the sky, and then we saw the bombers. They were caught in the lights. There were 3 of them in a V-shaped formation. And then just off to the side and behind were 3 more. And then there were 3 more until they were right close over the top of us. Then the bombs started. And soon the searchlights were overpowered by the huge fires that were beginning to burn. Our bombers were dropping, we found out a little later, by examining the bomb cases. Napalm bombs. They were 500-pound bombs, and each one was composed of 88 napalm capsules. The weapon had a small explosive charge in the center of the cluster of capsules. And the initial explosion was about 500 feet in the air. And when it blasted off, it scattered these little bombs in every direction. We watched the aircraft until they'd get right overhead, and then we'd bury our nose in the dirt and pray. Soon the fires had created winds of hurricane velocity. The flames were overhead even though the fires were some distance from where we were. The flat sides of the steel bomb cases that held the clusters or the capsules together until blown apart were sailing through the air at a tremendous velocity and landing inside. Some of them landed inside our camp fence. The Japanese guards did not take cover, and they stood on top of the ground in grave danger of being eliminated by flying debris. A couple of capsules landed in the compound, inside the compound, and they made a small crater, and it started our barracks on fire, but we were able to crawl out and get our barracks, get the fire put out. The onslaught continued for 3.5 hours. It would stop for a few minutes, and then here they'd come again. And then, even though it was our airplanes wiping out our enemy, we were glad when the fiasco was over. The next morning, every able-bodied man in camp was called out to go to the factory. And when we got outside the fence, we could not believe our eyes. Every farmhouse and building that had dotted the landscape was gone. The only structure that stood was our barracks. It was awesome and depressing. However, the steel mill was still standing, but most of the outbuildings of frame construction had burned. This included the covers over the fire brick, which were water soluble, and since they anticipated rain, we were forced to move all these bricks by hand to other areas that remained covered. It was a terrible job and almost more than we, in our weakened and starved conditions, could handle. The next morning, while working at the mill, we heard airplanes. The Japanese had constructed makeshift shelters at the mill, and on previous occasions, we had been assembled and marched to these shelters. This time we looked, and there were airplanes flying very low in several directions. Having just survived this massive air raid a few days before, we broke ranks and ran helter-skelter to these shelters. Nothing happened. No bombs were dropped. And the aircraft were soon gone. We were ordered to return to our compound, and when we arrived, Colonel Stubbs assembled us and told us that the war was over. The Japanese tried to describe the atomic bomb, but since none of us had any inkling as to what they were referring to, we were not impressed. Our minds were so numbed, and we had endured so many disappointments that there was not a spontaneous celebration. We were still starved, thousands of miles from home, and very uncertain as to what the immediate future would bring. There were about 140 of us who had survived, and we were surrounded by the enemy, who had just literally been burned out of their home. It was hard to believe what happened in the next couple of weeks. It is a lesson about war. First, the Japanese guards moved from the inside of the compound to the outside for our protection. We left the area at will and started swimming in the nearby small river. How refreshing it was. We hadn't had a bath more than a year. Little did we know that the river was full of dead Japanese who had attempted to escape the fires and relieve their burns caused by the air raid. The Japanese civilians, including children and the former unarmed guards, joined us. Their city of Toyama was 95% destroyed by the earlier air raid. Thousands had been killed outright or burned to death. We had been at war with them for almost 4 years, yet we felt safe in their midst. No animosity was expressed on either side. Two and a half years in the Philippine Islands, 1 year in Japan, and it was all over. It was hard to believe. We had had so many rumors. There had been so many disappointments so many times. It was unbelievable that this was even happening. An ultimatum to stop fighting the war was sent to Japan by the United States, and it was rejected. So on August the 6th, 1945, the atomic bomb Little Boy was dropped on Hiroshima. 3 days later, on August the 9th, Nagasaki suffered the same fate at the hands of the atomic bomb Fat Boy. The next couple of days, the U.S. Air Force flew over Japan, dropping leaflets stating that if they did not surrender, there would be no more bombs dropped. The same fate was in store for Osaka, Nagoya, Yokohama, and Kawasaki. There was some discussion in this country about dropping of the atomic bomb. There were those people that thought it was a terrible thing. Yes, it was a terrible thing, but it saved lives. The low fire bombing on July the 10th of 1945 killed more Japanese than both atomic bombs put together. On August the 14th, 1945, the Japanese Emperor Hirohito finally overruled his military chiefs and accepted Allied surrender terms. 2 U.S. warplanes, 2 crews, 2 bombs, no American casualties, and it was all over. Had it been necessary to invade Japan, it would have prolonged the war many months and cost an estimated 1 million or more lives on each side. 16 million Americans wore uniforms during the war, 216,000 of them women. Men in combat numbered 1.75 million. Over 292,000 were killed in action. Monetary costs of the war have been estimated at well over $1 trillion. What a price we pay for freedom. But we should remember, the price we pay for our freedom will never equal the price we would pay if we lost them. When it got to the ground, there was about 4 or 5 sheets sewed together, making a sack, and it was full of bread, warm bread, just as though it had been baked not too long ago. And it tasted just like cake to us. We hadn't had any bread in 3.5 years. The next day, the B-24s flew over and opened up their bomb bays, and it looked like a celebration. Parachutes come out of the bomb bays, yellow, green, red, purple, blue, all colors. And tied to them when they hit the ground was 55-gallon drums with fruit cocktail, peaches, pears, beans, peas, everything we have in this country that we take for granted. We were getting all of a sudden, and there was no one there to stop us from eating what we wanted of this. Each one was just as hungry as the next, and we became very sick, heaving from the top end and diarrhea at the bottom end. This high, rich food was like poison to our rundown systems. Our bodies were nothing but skin and bones. Our skin had just shrunk up on our bones. And when we started getting this rich food, we started putting on weight. And when we did, this skin that has all dried up and shrunk had to expand, just like when you blow up a balloon. And we were sore all over. You couldn't touch yourself. It was just like we was one big boil because our skin was starting to stretch. Well, a military man came into the camp, told us on such and such a day we were going to be taken out. There was some would go out on an airplane. We had a small airfield right close to where we were, and some would go on the airplane and some would go on the train to Yokohama. That day came, I was one that went on the airplane, and I remember getting on that airplane. There must have only been about 25 of us on there, but the pilot said, no, when we start to take off, he says, we want you all to crowd to the front just as far as you can. Get out of the tail end of that ship. Because he says, we might not get off the ground. We thought, wow. All we've been through now and here at the tail end, and we're on our way to freedom, and we might not even make it yet. So anyway, he revved the engines, and he took off, and we all crowded and pushed as hard as we could to get up to the cabin. And we kept going, and we wondered how long that runway was. Felt like we couldn't be much runway left. Finally, it did lift. Those that was up in front where they could look out to the cockpit, they could see the houses just clipping by under the airplane as we was going. When we got to Yokohama, they took us off the airplane. Never mind the name of the airport. I can't remember right now. But we got on trucks and they took us into Yokohama, to the harbor. And Yokohama had been bombed. It was a real mess. A lot of buildings had been burned out there. It was terrible. War is terrible. We were taken to the docks and we were put on a hospital ship. No, first we got to the docks and there was a big warehouse there. And we were asked to take off all our clothes and put them in a big bin there. And then they took and they sprayed us with powder. And they sprayed our hair. They sprayed our bodies. They sprayed. And it was kind of a discomfort, but this discomfort was minor because we knew we were losing our bosom buddies of a long time. We had acquired lice because we never was able to wash our clothes. At night, when we'd sleep in our clothes, we would work in our clothes, and we could feel these lice crawling around in the seams of our clothes. And of course, if you could get them between your fingernails and squash them, you could get rid of them that way, but there were so many you couldn't, so you just let them live. And then they gave us some new clothes. We were put on this hospital ship. We were able to take a good warm bath. And then we waited our turn in rotation to be taken to Okinawa. Finally it came and we were flown to Yokohama. And I think it was B-17s. And after being at Okinawa for a few days waiting, we were there, more rehabilitation, and then we were loaded on a B-20 or B-24. They had taken the Bombay racks out of the B-24s and they had put wooden seats in there, hung them in there somehow. And I'll tell you, it was kind of scary. We had no seat belts or anything, and we hung on for dear life. We got up in the air and we got to run into a storm. We was on our way to the Philippines, to Manila, and we run into a storm. They couldn't go up over the storm because we had no oxygen, the Bombays, for the prisoners there, so they went out, had to go out over the China coast. And when we hit a downdraft, the water would come up through the Bombay doors and douse us. And we got to thinking, we hoped that the man wouldn't push a wrong button sometime and dump us all out. And that's what happened to one load. Some of the prisoners was on one of these ships and got dumped out in the ocean. That'd be enough to make you mad, wouldn't it? Go through all that and then all of a sudden get dumped in the ocean on your way to freedom. But we finally got to the Philippine Islands, to Manila, and we were there for about a week and more rehabilitation, and then we were put on a ship, the Yarmouth, and we were sailing for America. We were all on deck that morning, that great morning, to spot land. Our land, America. We cheered, we yelled, we hugged each other, we cried. It had been 4 long years since we had left the States. And now we were going home to America. And I thought to myself, had anyone ever looked for the promised land more anxious than I? One more thing I'd like to say. On the 4th of July in 1943, a group of us in the 5th Air Base got together and had a little patriotic program, you might say. There was 2 or 3 fellows that stood up in front of this small group. We were at the WWII penal colony. We were under some palm trees close to where the hospital was and where the Japanese guards couldn't see us. And they had taken a blanket and they had rolled it up in a small roll, the length of the blanket. And they had this all rolled up and was holding it, and we were asked to sing God Bless America, and we did in low or in quiet voices so that the Japanese couldn't hear, and they start unrolling this blanket. And the first thing we saw was a red stripe, and then a white stripe. And at the red stripe and a white stripe was the American flag. Somebody had kept the American flag with us all this time and hadn't been caught. When we saw that, it tugged at our heartstrings, and the American flag is our symbol of freedom, and we wanted to be free, but we knew we couldn't. But years later, after I got home, when I worked for the post office department, I was on the mail route one day and I heard a reading that was given which reminded me of that incident on the 4th of July of 1943. And I'd like to give it to you. It's called, Why Do We Stand? A great sparkling band striked up the Star-Spangled Banner. An honor guard with their starched uniform marches past, with Old Glory held aloft. I feel a chill run through me, and I stand. Some might ask why. An actor with the golden voice takes us back some 200 years with those great words, "We the people of the United States." I feel that same chill, and deep inside I stand. Some might ask, why? Stars feeling guilty about their wealth strike out against our nation. and that chill is replaced with rage. And I stand. Some might ask, why? Some never ask why. Those silent middle Americans, you know the type, work hard, take pride in your labor. You pay your dues and you believe that you have to put something in before you take something out. And when you know it's right, you stand and you don't care when some might ask why. Because born with no guarantees of the future, our parents raised us the best they could. And along the way, they gave us some values. Common sense told them that we had to stand up to the bullies or we would run forever. Yet, no mother and no father sleeps well or rests easy with a child gone off to war. Those terrible, haunting memories. Some have holes in their hearts from the past, and some have heavy fears of the future. But they always taught us there are times when we have to stand. Even if it's silently, they ask why. Some of us try to tear down what we've been taught to build up and use racial prejudice and hate. And with them, we won't stand. And maybe they should ask why. Some of us feel that America's never wrong, but we must admit that our leaders sometimes are. People governing people is a haphazard business at best. But we who stand must be careful that it's never an injustice and never for our mistakes. Our founding fathers gave us the tools. Some of us have done well. The rest of us must try if there's to be any promise for tomorrow, no matter some may ask why. So, why do we stand? Well, when that grand old flag ripples in the wind, she seems to call out to all of us, liberty, justice, and freedom for all. And then I know if I stand and you stand when it's right and when America needs us, that someday with God's help, we will all be standing together and no one will need to ask why. May we be true to the stars and stripes which stand for individual liberty, for the free agency of man, for faith in God, service to our country and to our fellow men. God is just waiting to help us. His help is available. It always has been. Let's take advantage of his help by putting forth a little effort on our own part. Let us stand up and be counted and speak out in defense of those eternal virtues which made America great. Let's each one of us do our part to preserve our right, our constitutional rights, our God-given rights, our freedom in this great and wonderful land, America. And that in so doing, we may become better citizens of this great land and better members of this, the only true and living church on the face of the whole earth, of which I bear testimony, and is my prayer in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Did you tell them about your trip back to Japan, Lucy?
Oh, yeah. My wife and I, couple of months in 1987, all of 88, and a 3 months in 89, we went back to Japan on a mission. And the Japanese people there just treated us like we were the emperor and the empress. When they heard that I had been a prisoner of war, some of them had sobbed and cried. They didn't want this war. I thought when I went back there that I would go to the place where they had me working in their factories, to Yokkaichi, and I thought I would see if I could get my back pay. But the Japanese counselor to the president said if the factory was old when we were there, it had probably been tore down by now, and I thought it was pretty old then, so we probably wouldn't have got anything out of it. But it was just a thought. Now I've been on 2 missions to Japan now. The first mission to Japan was Mission Impossible. Does anyone have any questions they'd like to ask her?
I just wanted to mention, that he was asked to do 2 different firesides. And they wanted him to tell his prisoner of war experiences. Can you imagine talking to a people whose government had held you a prisoner for 3.5 years? But what a wonderful opportunity to teach the gospel of Jesus Christ, of love and forgiveness. He says no ill feelings.
Yeah, I have no ill feelings toward the Japanese people for what happened to me while I was in their country. Those in the military that treated us inhumanely will someday have to answer for what they done. But as far as I'm concerned, I don't feel ill feelings.
I
Yeah.
just wondered how many here knew about the park that you, I can't think of the
I
word.
don't know. The Veterans
The
Memorial?
The Veterans Memorial up
If you ever get up to Tremonton, you ought to go and see the memorial that we have built there in Tremonton, the Veterans Memorial. It's quite nice. We have about 3,000, little over 3,000 names, and that's just from the North Fox Elder County. And it's
This is why the Lord preserved his life and lost his leg. He had one more thing he had to do. And that was chairman's memorial.
It's the nicest thing you'll find in Tremonton. It's just beautiful little place. Uncle AC has chaired that and united all the veterans and got Brother Monson to come there at the dedication and Representative Hanson. It was really a spiritual experience. I was so proud to be his nephew. But, these two were the driving force that made that thing possible.
I think it was a $150,000 project, and all through donations.
Uncle Ace,
yes.
what, did your family, how did they react when you came home and did they think they were ever gonna see you again?
They didn't know where I was. There was never any word got back that they knew I was a prisoner of war.
And that's all they.
That's all. Yeah. They didn't know if I was alive, you know. Yes, sir.
My mother and dad, day and night, when Uncle Ace was gone, was always trying to find out some answer. They was on the phone continually in prayer, wondering when Uncle Ace was gonna come back, and when they got word that he was alive and was gonna come back, you never seen such a thing in my life. My parents, the tears just came to their eyes, and they cried and cried and cried. They knew their prayers had been answered.
You did get one letter, and it was from Priscilla and Mervyn.
I did. There were letters that got through to some of the prisoners, and even packages got through to some of the prisoners. And they sent packages to me, and they sent letters to me. But a lot of the letters were returned by a censor, because something in there was said that shouldn't go. One letter got through, and that was from Mervyn Priscilla. It was 1 year old from the time they had written it till the time I got it. It was sent to the island of Formosa. I had never been on the island of Formosa. We were in the Philippine Islands, and someone there, of course the Japanese knew where we were. They knew our names and knew where we were. And someone had written on there in a red pencil, Davao. And the letter got to Davao eventually, and so I was glad to get the letter, I'll tell you that.
Is that the only letter you got?
The only letter, all the time. And we were able to write letters home, and I don't know how many letters got home. But we had a little form we had to fill out to send, and it had it all in there. They had everything written in there. I am well, or I am sick, I am treated good, I am treated bad, and all this, and and you'd put a check on all the things. Well, they're not about to send anything back there that that's going to look bad for the Japanese military. And so I don't know if any of them ever got back or not. They never told me that they did, my parents.